Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Narrative Alchemist. This week, I had the pleasure of interviewing my friend and colleague, Stacy Russo. Stacy has a Master of Arts and a Master of Library and Information Science, and is a writer, poet, visual artist, librarian, and DIY oral historian who is committed to creating art and books for a more peaceful world. She serves as librarian and associate professor at Santa Ana College and is a current PhD student at California Institute of Integral Studies. She is the author of several nonfiction books, the editor of 2 essay collections, a published poet, and the author-illustrator of 2 children's picture books. Stacy's books have been adapted for university classes and featured on National Public Radio, Pacifica Radio, the Canadian Broadcasting System, Sirius XM Radio, KCET Artbound, LA Weekly, and various other media channels. One day I started a new life. An art book featuring Stacy's collages and mixed media work over the last decade is forthcoming from Sacramento-based Litwin Books. Stacy is a longtime vegan who discovered animal rights and became politically aware through the punk rock scene of the 1980s. If she came into a few $1 million, she would follow her dream of opening a community gathering place called the Wild Librarian Bakery and Bookstore. Stacy eats chocolate before noon every day and always takes her coffee black. She lives in Santa Ana, California, and Jack and Lily, her 2 dogs from Coastal German Shepherd Rescue. Welcome, Stacy. I'm so glad you're here with us today. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm so grateful that you're able to join us today. For those of you who know Stacy, you may know her through CIIS, where I'm also attending, but also through Stacy's books, and maybe you even work with her if you happen to come across this interview at some point in the future. Stacy, I was reading your biography earlier before our interview, and a couple things I picked up on like right away, and I wanted to ask you about those before we even start to have our dialogue and chit chat. But I wanted to ask you first of all about what is a DIY oral historian who is committed to creating art and books for a more peaceful world. What is that, and what does that mean to you?
Yeah. So, I guess, just a real quick answer first is the reason I call it DIY is because I don't have formal academic training to be an oral historian, right? But I do have a little bit of training in that, which I can talk about, um, which is definitely tied to this question. So I think it was in 2012, I attended training through an organization called Voice of Witness, which is in San Francisco. It's an absolutely wonderful organization. And their whole mission is about storytelling for social justice. And what that entails is both training, that they do training for educators and other people to do oral history projects to gather people's personal stories and then hopefully create and publish personal narrative collections. But they also publish their own books, which are personal narrative collections, basically oral history, collections. And they are just stunning. Like the way they do it is wonderful. So there are different ways, of course, to do oral history. If you were to read oral histories, let's say from a library or a community organization, such as a local history organization or something like that, where they do oral history as part of their work, then you're most likely going to be reading an interview format with everything there, right? Like every little thing that happens during the interview is probably captured, in that document. The way that the Voice of Witness trained me, which I love, is that yes, you do interview somebody, but then you work with that person to slightly edit and reshape the story, where you of course retain the person's story and ask them to make sure it's okay before it would ever be published or anything. But you make it into something that's very readable, very accessible,
Mhm.
and is really in a lot of ways like a work of art, So it almost reads like sometimes almost like a novel or something. It's like, oh no, this is actually a person's interview, like they're telling their story, but they do it in a way where they often also remove the questions. So you just read and get completely immersed in the person's story. Um,
This sounds like the life story interview. Um, it it's something that I'm actually looking at as well. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You
yeah,
reminded me of the life story interview. I can't remember the author who created that method of dialoguing with other people to bring out their stories, and then talk in a way. It's an interview, but it's a two-way conversation.
yeah, yeah, definitely. So, so basically, I went through that training. It was just 1 week. It was wonderful with Voice of Witness. And I left there and it's completely changed my life as a writer. So, because I was already, of course, a writer and poet and, all that before, but, and someone who loves like autobiography and loves oral history and all of that. Um, so it really showed me how I can bring social justice, I can bring activism work more into my life as a writer, and that I could interview people that in some way have a shared experience or
Mhm.
something about them that overlaps in some way. And I could hopefully bring them these stories to an audience. And that's where it gets into hopefully creating a more peaceful world through my writing. So that's where that aspect comes. And then it's kind of the punk rock aspect of, oh, like, well, I'm not an oral historian here, but I'm a writer. I do have English degrees. So I just want to say that though. I do have degrees in English. So it's not as if I don't have some academic training there. But I thought, yeah, I'll just go out and do it. I'll just go out and start doing my oral history projects after, 5 days of training. So that's why I call it that, like DIY oral history, historian.
What how did those 5 days impact you personally?
That's really interesting because part of the workshop involved, well, first they had people come in and talk about oral history projects they had done. And I mean, it was like so stimulating, like in a creative way. And I was just like, wow, like blown away by these projects. And, but there was also a part of the workshop where we spent time interviewing one of the other participants, and then we got interviewed, and then we had to quickly, over a few days, reshape the interview. And then we sat together at the end, and you heard, with everyone's permission, of course, you heard somebody read your story, to the group. And now these are, of course, pretty short considering the time limit we were working under, but it was so profound to hear your story being witnessed. And then what was interesting too was that even though it was definitely my story, um, and other people had this experience as well, it was almost like you got in touch with your story in a way, your own story, like, wow, that's me, that's my story. Um, and it just showed how transformative storytelling is.
Mhm.
you know, and it showed how much courage is involved with telling your story. And like Voice of Witness now doesn't use the terminology safe space. They use brave space, right? Like because of that, you want people to feel courageous enough to be able to tell their story. But then also, I guess the bottom line is I discovered how the telling of a story and the listening or the witnessing are both necessary, and they can both be a political act, even depending on what the story's about. Because if there's no witness to the story, if there's no deep listening to the story, then it's still a form of silencing, right? So that's why the witness is also important as well as the storyteller. So yeah, it's amazing how you can learn so much in a short time.
Would you say
um
the publishing part as well acts as a witness? Or do you physically have to have another person reflecting and telling your story back to you in order to make that impact?
yeah, that's interesting. I don't think the publishing has to be a part of it. um I think that takes it into like a another realm.
Hmm.
I think for example, doing my first project, which was with women who grew up in the punk rock scene of the 70s and 80s in Southern California, there were things that happened during the interview, the one-on-one interview, which you wouldn't see as the reader of the book, the published book. Um, for example, sometimes during the interview, people cried,
Mm.
even if it didn't seem to me as if I was asking anything that would stir up something like that. And I realized that just the fact that somebody is deeply listening and isn't talking much, but is really just listening to someone's story is so rare.
Yes.
And the fact that people felt like there's value in my story, even if it's only one person that sees that, it's emotionally just very charged, you know.
Hmm.
And some of these aspects are even seen in the film The Artist is Present, which there's no talking actually. It's just the artist sitting in front of somebody in silence looking at the person. It's just so rare these days that that happens. So yeah, to answer that, I think simply two people getting together and hearing, being witnessed and listening in that way is already deep enough and enough that needs to happen. Um, the publishing aspect, though, takes then that story and can bring it to communities, can really, in some respects, potentially change the world, hopefully,
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
and allows other people to see, oh my gosh, my story, this is like my story in this book. So I would hear that from readers, like, this is me, even though their story's not in there. So like they felt validated from these other people's stories. So that's like a whole other thing then that happens with the storytelling.
It's fascinating. You're describing, well, a couple things that I'm thinking about. Collective auto ethnography is one where you have the art of autoethnography where someone's writing about their own life stories. Um, and generally what happens in after that is they publish it for the public and in order to change or affect society. when you talk about collaborative or collective autoethnography, people are still doing the autoethnographic part, the self storytelling, but what you describe really beautifully is that relationship between the witness and the storyteller and how they work together to create this symbiotic exchange of energy almost, where one is affecting the other because they're seeing themselves in the other. And
Yeah.
I don't want to go too deep, but it's a very meta kind of experience. And one in a video I just published a couple weeks ago is talking we're in the middle of a series on narrative therapy, and I've boiled narrative therapy down to two primary steps or phases. One is name it and then reframe it. And the name it part is the externalizing one's story, no matter what that story might be, or about an event or a memory or an emotion. Box it, can put it into a container, and then reframe it by restructuring and restorying the story. And what you're describing in conjunction with or collaboration with another person is just amazing and beautiful. That whole community aspect of being authentic and vulnerable to another person, and the
Yeah.
amazing transformation that can occur.
Yeah. I really like that you use the word vulnerability because that is definitely such a part of the process. And also for the person doing the interview to have empathy, right, and compassion and be open to whatever happens. But the other thing too about the collaborative aspect, or once it's published, is that's so fascinating is that people are changed from somebody's story, but they never talk to that person, right?
Mhm.
Um, they never know that person who shared the story. So it shows how that person being courageous enough to share their story can have such an impact that they might not even know, you know? So there's just so much to it that's wonderful. Yeah.
I
And
know, having, going through this doctoral program with you, working on our PhDs, could you share with the audience a little bit about what is your research, and what is your focus in terms of what you want to publish, and then maybe even a little bit about what you've already published in terms of some of the books and stories you've done for children and things like that, and just give us a little background on the importance of those different pieces of art in your life personally.
yeah. So, in regards to the large oral history projects that have become published books, the first one that I mentioned is with the punk rock women from the 70s and 80s. And that ties into me because I grew up, as you said, and mentioned in the bio, in the punk rock scene. And women's stories are not found near as much in rock and roll or music history. But another really important aspect to that project is even when there are women's stories, they're usually the performers. So the thing that makes that project very different and very punk rock, I feel, is that a large number of the participants were members of the audience. They were the fans who were there in the audience, right? But there's also DJs, journalists, artists, people that created zines. So it really brings this whole this holistic vision of like the punk rock scene, not just the performers. And I think that's important because history is often about the people on the stage, the big
Mm.
names, but the real history is with the people and the different aspects of it, right? That's how you get the whole understanding of the history, not just the powerful people. Um, and that's the first project I did. And then the second project was well, there's a smaller project. I won't mention that one necessarily, but then the next like big book length one was with activist, and it was activist doing activism work in a lot of different contexts to show how they're all interrelated. Um, Primarily, or at least I think a majority of the activists were activists of color in that book, also some trans activists. So really just to show how different forms of oppression are interconnected and that all these different forms of activism are needed, right? So those are activist stories, like how they became an activist and then what they're doing. And then two of the people I interviewed during that project were one was in her 80s and one was close to 90, and they were so active and vibrant. And that led to my most recent project, which was with creative women who are age 70 or older. So it's titled Beyond 70, to work against age discrimination and gender discrimination, and to present these stories of women, they're actually age 70 to 98, who are still very active out in the world doing their art and all. So those are the book projects. And then in regards to trying to think of what else you were asking me. Oh, the PhD. Okay. So that big thing, that's right. How could I forget? Um, so yeah, so for my PhD, I've decided, I'm not going to do interviews as part of my project. I've done so many interview projects, I'm going to do something a little different, but I'm still using stories. So I'm using published autobiographies of women who have had an experience on either a temporary or more permanent basis of creating what I call a solo home. So a home of their own outside of the dominant marriage and family paradigm, and what the creation of that home has meant to them. So I have a bunch of questions I'm exploring in regards to that using these narratives. And then that's part of my story as well. So, because I currently live in a solo home and I have for, I guess, since 2011. Um, so over 10 years, I've lived in the solo home. And what that experience has been for me as well is a little part of it, but my focus is mostly analyzing these women's stories in the autobiography. And then, but yeah, stories are also just a part of my life in general, beyond that, as an artist. And like you mentioned, the children's books, and in other ways in poetry. So even fictional stories, like things that are not actually like real life stories, although fiction I feel is definitely also real. But
Yeah.
so those are other parts. Like with my poetry, is often characters appear in my mind, and I write the poem in the first person, like through the voice of the character. So stories are just like a part of daily life, right? And like
Yeah.
all kinds of ways.
Well, it's great that you point that out. I think a lot of people, and I'm generalizing, but I think most people are not cognizant of that fact that stories are our lives. Every moment of our life is a story encapsulated, whether it's a thought, an emotion, an event, and we turn those events and memories and thoughts into memory, and they impact who and what we become because we end up identifying with those events instead of and many people do it unconsciously where they become something that isn't really truly them. But through the process of externalizing and naming that event through storytelling, you can reframe it and understand that you are not that event, and you can reshape who and what you are. I wanted to ask you, in the United States and our current political climate, I know you're in California, so you may not be impacted by this, but what is the impact on society as we see book banning and things like that happening, given that you're a storyteller, an author, and a librarian? Um, from your perspective, what is the impact on society by when stories of others are suppressed or even banned in some way when they're not allowed to be expressed or shared with society.
Yeah, I mean, the impact is so huge, right? Because, and I guess the thing I think of right away is that learning stops. I feel like learning, understanding different people's lives, being able to learn about ourselves as well as learning about others, that when stories are silenced, that completely stops. And it also creates a situation where people whose stories are already oppressed in some way, when they're systematically oppressed, like with a book banning or like, things like that, right? Removing books from libraries or in the classroom or whatever, it makes that person's story and those communities of stories even more marginalized and harmed. And then, when we don't learn and understand other people's stories, things happen. And it may not feel like, or it may seem really out there to say this, but what ultimately does happen? Well, things I feel like racism and all kinds of stigmas and stereotypes and all these things are allowed to perpetuate more and more and more, right? Because there's no learning through other stories. Because what we're mostly seeing, right, from these recent bans, it's usually stories dealing with racism or how people have been oppressed, or stories of the LGBTQ plus community. Those are the stories that are being removed, right? Or not, exposure to them is being limited. And what is the worst thing then that happens? Violence happens,
Mm.
right? So there is an extension, I feel, from suppression of people's stories to violence. So ultimately, it's a violent act, I feel, to not allow somebody's story to be told, to be silenced.
Psychological violence that turns into physical at some point because the fear
Right,
of the other, the fear of the unknown, and the ignorance that's perpetuated by not wanting to know about another person's life through their story and not being willing to reciprocate with your story because you might be an oppressor because you don't want to share your story, or that you don't find someone who's willing to um, can have compassion and empathy for you after you've told your story, that you might be in a situation or a community that does not support that. So
right,
I think it's even more important today to have to be aware of things that are being banned, and uh, finding avenues and ways to get your story out there, no matter what end of this political spectrum you might be on, because your story is invaluable to yourself and to others, because
right.
they are transformative.
Yeah, I think too, like hearing about this can really cause despair. And but it is also important to know and to think about the fact that doing this also for people who are trying to silence or oppress, which is very harmful, but it often backfires on them because you're going to then have someone like me. Now, I am in California, so that is true. And I'm in an academic library as well. But what do I do when it's time to order books? Well, let's look and see what's been banned, and we're going to order all those books, right?
Yep.
So, so in some ways, it makes people seek out those stories then, So it's just better to let the stories out there, like just let the stories out there
And you choose to interact with them as you want. That's what true freedom is. You have the choice to engage or not engage. But by
right.
trying to silence other stories and narratives, you're silencing yourself. And what
Yes,
you mentioned, it comes back to bite you. It's a slippery slope. And then we
right,
see other books banned that you're like, well, wait, wait, whoa, whoa, I didn't want that book banned. And then,
right.
and then all of a sudden, people are starting to ban everything.
Yeah,
So it's
exactly.
not a
And
very good environment for learning.
yeah, and I think too, um, it creates when stories are silenced and or there's a stigma, like stereotypes and all, it creates shame about somebody's story then, right? They're afraid to tell their story, and that can actually impact someone for their whole life. Um, like one of the things in our culture that's there's a lot of silence around is of course like domestic violence and sexual assault. So people don't tell their story, they don't even report it when
Mhm.
something happens to them, because of what has been seen in the past, what happens when someone tells their story. So just another reason why it's better just to let the stories out there.
Yeah. I found that in my own research, LGBTQ abuse and sexual abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, and spiritual religious abuse, um, especially the physical sexual abuse goes unreported so much, and that there's no voice for those individuals. And of course, women being, a huge target for domestic abuse and violence that isn't reported. Um,
Right.
one of the things that I've noticed though too is, and this could be a double-edged sword, but social media tends to be an outlet for people to share their stories anonymously. And I think there is transformation happening there, but then it can be used as a weapon against others as well. And so for those that might be watching today's interview, being cognizant that when I mentioned there are other avenues for getting your story out there, social media is one of them, but to be very cautious with that because it can be used
Yeah.
against you.
Yeah, I think that's really good that you said that. I think even though we're talking about how wonderful it is to share stories and all, it's also important to always know that your story is your own
Mhm.
story ultimately. You're the only person who really owns the story. Um, and it's important to be careful about who you share your story with, right? And this your story should be told only when you feel like you want to tell your story and you feel safe to tell your story. So that's also why with any storytelling projects I do, I always allow people up to the last minute to withdraw their story if they want, or anytime during the interview, if they don't like it, they don't have to continue, of course. And I only want them to feel safe and good. And if they don't wish to participate, I would understand that. So, yeah, I think you're right on to say that. It's important to be careful too about where you tell your story.
And this channel is really about using storytelling and narrative as a tool for empowerment and for self-actualization and
Yeah,
for moving yourself into a state of uh, gratitude and um, gratitude that you're aware of these narratives, that some of the narratives may be external and imposed on you that you were completely unaware of, but that you become aware, not to use the overused term woke, but you awaken to the idea that, wait a minute, that's not who I am, but I have lived that way as if it was who I am. I identified with it. Could you tell us a little bit, Stacy, um, about external narratives that are imposed on you or people that you've known? Was there an awareness that occurred through that 5-day oral storytelling workshop, that people are like, wait a minute, I told that story as if it were something that I believed, but it's no longer my belief because I externalized it. What are your views on external narratives?
And that's interesting. So you're saying in the process of telling the story and hearing it, you realize, wait, that's not really my story. Is that what you mean?
It could be your parents, it could be a political rhetoric, it could be religious, socioeconomic. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to really, kind of think about that more. I know that there's an external story of like who a domestic abuse victim is. And because I am a survivor of domestic abuse, and I remember when I was trying to get help at one point, and maybe I'm not answering your question, but I'll just explain this. Um, and I was trying to find a place I could go to be safe. And when I called to get help, often like with a battered women's shelter, somewhere like that, um, they would assume things about me, even in that context, and they would explain things that were offered there, such as substance abuse class or something like that. And I said, well, that's not what I'm calling about. I don't have a substance abuse problem, you know. And other things that were explained of how I could get help that wouldn't help me at all. And I was like, that's not me. That's not my story. That might be the story for other women. And I totally get that. That's why they have that story, because it does exist out there. But it's not my story. That's not what's going to help me. So I don't
Mhm.
know if that kind of gets to what you're speaking to there. But and then most people, when they found out my story, people that knew me were they were kind of shocked, but really understanding. But a few people, one in particular, still wanted to like enforce an external story on me that wasn't my story.
Mhm.
So that's very painful, right? And part of the reason why I didn't tell my story was because I didn't want this other story imposed on me that wasn't me.
It's another form of abuse, psychological
Yeah,
abuse.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one way where I've experienced that.
Mhm.
Um, where now it's like, well, I'm going to tell my story because I don't want that external story. And now I feel like I can tell my story and it's healing for me, even though it can be hard to tell.
I've noticed, and part of my research as well is looking at the relationship between myself and others and how we each, unless we're aware that we're doing this, we often project our story, a narrative onto another based on what we see, what we experience with events, or memories of things that have happened in the past with other people, and we
Yeah.
make an assumption or a leap, and we project that narrative onto them, and we layer it, and we ignore the authentic real story of that individual, which
Yeah.
creates an issue with relationship, not intimate. Well, it could include intimate relationship, but also friendships, coworkers, fellow students and peers and things like that, where we think
Yeah.
we know the other person, but we're really just projecting our idea of them on to them.
Yeah. And that's interesting. And I think, obviously that sometimes happens, and it's not meant to be harmful or anything like that. This can even be like unconscious that we're doing that, right?
Yeah.
And then when that's happened in my experience, and then I discover something about the person that doesn't fit at all
Yeah.
with the story, I'm like, whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Like, where was all that coming from? That I was thinking all this about this person. It's not even what who they are,
hmm
right? So that's that's really interesting.
The place that I go to often is childhood, because we have, as children, we're really kind of blank slates, and we're open to the conditioning and the projection onto us by our parents and others. And we end up internalizing those stories and narratives as if they were our own, without even being aware, until there is some kind of an event that causes a catalyst. For me, it was attempting suicide when I was 19. Well, there were other events too, but really starting to parse my mother's stories, my father's stories, and their life from my own, and saying, oh, and also things like religion being imposed, political ideology, and things like that. Even in the education system, a certain narrative being
Yeah,
imposed upon you. You have to do this or live this way, and really not coming into the fullness of my own story until I was into my 30s and 40s, to really start to get an idea of, well, who am I authentically and deep
yeah,
down? Um, and I learned that from what you were mentioning, similar to what you were mentioning, your 5 day oral storytelling, where kind of like that life story interview, where through the transpersonal psychology program that I went through, our cohort had face to face meetings every August, where we would fly to California and have a week together, and we were able to have those dialogues with one another and be authentic. And I started to realize, wow, I never really shared my story. I'm always sharing the memories of my mother or my father, or
yeah.
something that wasn't me, the gay community, even the LGBT community,
Fascinating.
that wasn't even really my narrative.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting too that sometimes when you tell a story that you've told to yourself for a while, and you tell somebody this story that maybe you haven't really shared that much, and you tell, and let's say it's someone that knows you pretty well, or like a close friend or whatever, and then they say, oh, like they respond in some way to the story, and then you realize your story that you were telling isn't really true,
Mhm.
or it gets you into like an understanding of something that happened to you. And if you hadn't been courageous enough to tell the story, you would never have made that realization,
Exactly.
you know? And I'll tell you something that's really a intense and personal example of that. Was something had happened to me at a party when I was pretty young, like 18, 19. And I never really I described it in a way to people. The few times I described it, I would say, I won't say the person's name, but I would say, he forced me to have sex with him. And I was telling some real specific details of what happened to my friend about 10 years ago. And she just said straight out to me, "You were raped." And I was,
Mm.
and I never said that. But if you would, I'm not going to say it now, but if you were to hear the particulars of what happened to me, and even things about how I fought or screamed and tried to get help and all this stuff, of course you would know I was raped, but I never could say that. And of course, I never told any like authority figure or anything like that what had happened, because I was at a party and I had had something to drink. And I guess I also got caught up in the narrative of, well, I put myself there, you know?
Which is usually society's narrative,
Yeah, that's a society story.
a
Um,
victimization society, and
exactly. Because you
you
were
asked for it.
wearing like a short skirt, or you were out too late as a woman. What were you doing there? You know, which totally, yeah, puts the whole reason like this violent act happens onto the victim. Yeah.
Mm, yeah.
So that blew me away, that, and if I would never have told that story, I would probably still think, oh, he just forced me to have sex with him, right?
And
Which all,
that's powerful, because
yeah,
that's not authentic to you. That's not the truth.
right. Yeah. So yeah, it's just interesting, like all the layers of stories, and that you really have to get to a very vulnerable, authentic place to really get to something resembling like truth, right? Like what is really the true story here? Can we figure that out, you know?
One of the things I I wrote a couple of years ago that this process is, if you're vulnerable to yourself and authentic to yourself, you basically are standing naked to the world. Um, not to be not to open yourself to abuse, further abuse, or victimization, but to look at how you are perpetuating self-victimization and self-abuse by not sharing your story. And it doesn't have to be with the world, it could be with another person, it could even be with yourself, because our primary relationship is to ourselves,
Yeah,
and being authentic. And the way we do that is through the process of writing poetry, or writing a short story, or doing something oral. It could even
right.
be writing a screenplay.
Yeah.
So uh, I'm curious. So I don't want to make our interview completely like, I know you and I we can talk about some very serious things, and also academic, but um, what is the Wild Librarian Bakery and Bookstore?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that, because that is definitely a story that, so many years ago I had a home bakery permit called the Wild Librarian Bakery. So I did actually have a little business. Didn't do a whole lot with it, but I would bake and I had the labels and all, and I baked for this one restaurant, just did it on the side. And it was baked goods inspired by great books,
Mm.
So um, like one my favorite book is Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola SD. So there was the wild blueberry Women Who Run with the Wolves muffin, right? So things like that.
Uh,
Um,
that sounds good.
yeah, it was really good. And then this dream just kind of took hold of me, of a place, like an actual place, and it would be the Wild Librarian Bakery and Bookstore. So it'd be like a combo of both, so yes, I would no longer work at the library, but I would open this community gathering space. It would have baked goods, coffee, and all kinds of events taking place, and books. And I got so into it. Even a lot of my students knew about it. I would talk about it and tell them about it,
Where is this place? Where's the address?
Yeah, a lot of them were, like, hoping they could work there someday. They're like, "Will you hire me?" Like, it was almost like becoming, like, the real thing, you know? I even, like, drew out, like, a diagram of, like, where the tables and chairs would be, like, all this stuff, the list of the genres of the books that would be there for sale and all this. And, um, then, one day, like, I guess after, like, these wild dreams, I realized, "Oh, I would need a whole lot of money do that, and I don't see and that's very risky, and I would have to definitely leave my career to do that, and I don't see how that's possible." So then it just became so I created a zine about it, the Wild Librarian Bakery and Bookstore, which is all about my dream of opening this place, and then I realized, you know what I can do is I can use my imagination to create this place through stories. And so I created the children's picture book, the Wild Librarian Bakery and Bookstore, which is, the place. But then what I did that is the most imaginative and so great is a novel, right? And it's Stella Peabody. That's the main character, who's loosely me, of course. Um, Stella Peabody's Wild Librarian Bakery and Bookstore, and it's located in Santa Ana. And there's these characters I created that are regular guests that come in there to the place, and all these things that happen. So it's all like a fictional story I created to make this place real. So, like when you read the novel, hopefully people feel like they're there, at
They're
this
there.
place and all. But it feels very real to me. Like
Yeah.
the characters, like they seem like real people, and I can see where they live and everything. Like I know all about them, and
It sounds like Stella would know Anna Madrigal from the Tales of the City books by Armistead Maupin, all about San
uh,
Francisco in the
yeah,
70s and 80s, which is a fantastic series of books that I love. And I'm like, oh, we could just go down to the bakery and we'll see Stella and everybody that's there.
yeah, that is so great. I mean, I've had people say if that place really opened, I would actually move so that I could live near there.
That's why I moved to Portland because of Powell's Bookstore, and
I can
everything.
understand that. Yeah,
It's fascinating that you're manifesting these dreams and you're changing people's lives through the stories that you're telling to the point where
yeah,
they think it's real. It's a real place.
yeah,
And that's how it becomes real. You could
yeah,
always get a small business personal loan too, or a small business
yeah.
loan.
There's a house where one of the characters lives. It's like a real house though here. The character is Mary Chin, and it's like 2 blocks or so from the campus where I work. And so some days if I drive down that street and I look, I'm like, oh look, there's Mary Chin's house. Whoever lives in there has no idea that, there's this fictional psychologist, who lives there in that house.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's wonderful. So are you going to create more books after this first one?
I don't know. I I guess I desire so much to really have the place. I don't know if I'll create more with it, but I certainly do love it.
Well, now I want to read the book, and I've got your Amazon bio page open with all of your books, which I'm going to put a link for everyone who's watching today's interview. I'll put a link to the Stacy's Amazon page in the description below. But I'm gonna want a couple more books in the series if I read the first book. So please, make some kind of a very lighthearted gesture. Oh yeah, well, there might be a second book coming out at some point.
You know what's interesting is at least two of the characters in the novel were characters from poems I wrote years ago, and then they just expanded.
It expanded. That's awesome. I'm definitely going to be buying as soon as our interview is done here today. I'm going to be purchasing a copy of that because now I want to read it. Summer light reading is what I will
I
chalk
hope
that
you
up
enjoy
as.
it. Yeah.
Stacy, is there anywhere else other than the Amazon? Do you have a website or anything that you'd like to share with our audience that they can find your work? And are you on LinkedIn or anything like that?
I just have my regular website, which is
Okay,
just Stacy, Stacy, like a hyphen or a dash, Russo, Russo.com.
perfect.
And yeah, I started an independent press that I hope to publish other writers and myself through in the future. I actually did the novel. That was my first thing, was the bakery novel independently instead of going through a publisher this time. And that's wildlibrarianpress.com.
I
Yeah.
saw that today when I was looking through some of your books. I was like, did she self-publish? Yes, she did.
I did. Yeah, after years of traditional publishing, I decided just to do that on my own. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Congratulations. I think that's great. And
Thank you.
you're owning your stories by bringing to life the bakery and the library. That's really, but it's like all this beautiful poetry that rhymes and goes together, and it's like a complete circle.
Yeah, it feels like that.
That's awesome. That's basically what I've been trying to do over the last couple of years, publishing, but also writing personal narrative, getting back into my YouTube channel here on the Narrative Alchemist, kind of like a full circle and bringing some of these things to life in order to help other people see themselves or experience their own story through the stories of others and their
Yeah,
own lives in reflection.
it's
So,
wonderful.
yeah, I will put the link to your site and Amazon in the description below. Stacy, thank you so much. This has
Thank
been a wonderful
you.
chat today. I've enjoyed having you. I hope we can get you back in a couple of months as well, maybe for, that you're announced the second part of your Stella story. Stella Peabody's Wild Librarian Baking and Bookstore. It's right here. I've got it ready. Got it ready
Yeah.
to go.
Thank you, Dwayne.
Thank you. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining
You
us today.
too. Okay, bye-bye.